PadSplit is a paid sponsor of our show. Today on the show, we have Atticus from PadSplit. And PadSplit, for those of you that don't know, is when you can rent places by the room for a week versus during a traditional single-family long-term rental.
Yeah, what was really interesting is that most people stay 9 months.
Yeah.
So they rent by the week, but they stay 9 months. So he's definitely hitting a niche from an affordability standpoint. This is one that you're going to want to listen to.
So Atticus, let's start at the beginning. What were you trying to accomplish when you started PadSplit?
Really, from the very beginning, I wrote an application on scalable ways to address and solve the affordable housing shortage. And that was the express purpose of the company. It's still baked into our mission today, which is to help solve the affordable housing shortage, one room at a time, while leveraging housing as a vehicle for financial empowerment. And yeah, I mean, I was at a point in my career where I had created a successful business and was a far cry from where I was in the early days, just scraping and clawing my way, and was not as concerned about just the income that we had from the rental properties that I had accumulated were covering our cost of living. And I had 4 kids. I wasn't worried about paying for them for college. And it got to a point where I was like, well, what's next for me in my life, and what's the legacy I want to leave, and what happens if I get hit by a bus tomorrow? And ultimately, what that brought me to was, look, I think I have a real possibility here of creating significant social impact around the country and potentially around the world. And this solution I could see absolutely scaling.
So, you know, what's interesting about the U.S., and people don't realize this, is we're one of the only countries where, you know, we don't share family housing. Like, our parents don't live with us, and then our grandparents don't live with us. Like, we all have an individual house and an individual room, and that's really uncommon. And I think what PadSplit's doing is taking the family element out of it, but saying like, hey, 4 people can live in a 4-bedroom house. Like, one person doesn't have to bear the burden of this all on their own, even though that's what we're used to as Americans.
Oh, no question. Yeah. And I mean, it's not a new idea, right? This has been around for a long, long time. I tell the story about my great grandmother in Pikesville, Maryland, who rented rooms in her old Victorian house. One of those people became my mother's godfather. It was just a laborer in the community who had lived in this room for 12 years that became the godfather for my mom. It's been around for a long time. I think what we really do is just make it scalable for individual real estate investors to be able to go do 1, 2, 10, 100, many hundreds of houses should they so choose. And we take a lot of the operational complexity out of the equation. But so much of it, to your point, is just rebuilding the cultural mindset of it's okay to share housing. And it's always been okay to share housing when you're a student or a recent grad, or like I'm here in DC right now, and every staffer on the Hill basically shares housing because DC housing is so expensive. And it's okay when you're older, right? When you're in a assisted living or independent living facility. But for whatever reason in the US, it's become culturally unacceptable to think about shared housing in between the times when you're a student or when you're old enough to be in shared home as a senior.
Hey, so let's talk about the win-win on both sides of the equation here. You know, because I think we're heading into this, you know, call it inflationary time, or I guess we're in it, and wages aren't keeping up with costs. So this benefits the homeowner, but it also benefits, it's an affordable housing play. So it's interesting how it solves both pieces.
Well, I knew that was key from the outset, right? I had been a real estate investor almost my entire career. I was not sold on the idea that all landlords were evil, because I was one, and certainly didn't wake up every morning and tell myself what a terrible person I was because I own rental properties. And I didn't believe that about the industry either, and knew lots of folks that I thought were really great operators in this space. And so I knew that it had to be profitable for the owners to adopt this model. But I also knew that we had increasing barriers to entry for renters that just didn't make sense. And I was always really interested to scratch the surface on, well, why does a deposit matter? And does that actually mitigate the risk of someone damaging the unit or not paying? Why is rent always due on the first of the month? Why does no landlord ever include utilities? And I knew that all of those questions had a pretty significant impact on the affordability of the unit, but also whether or not someone could ever qualify for it. And so a big part of the model was trying to address those questions to see, can we remove those barriers to entry and still make it profitable for investors? And so part of the theory behind PadSplit was making housing both more affordable and more profitable simultaneously. And the reason why it works is because we've aligned those incentives, and that's the only reason why we've been able to grow as large as we have.
So what pushback do you get though? Because I know that, with cities and HOAs, there's a lot of pushback to this kind of thing.
It can be. It really depends on the frame of reference of that local community. I would argue that for anyone in a neighborhood where there are rentals, period, a co-living model is far superior to a traditional rental. And there's a pretty straightforward reason, which is like an operator in a co-living model has visibility inside the home 24/7. They're professionally managed. They're going to make sure that the grass is always cut. They're sending out cleaners twice a week. And because you've got 4, 5, 6 people sharing that home, like they have eyes inside that unit all the time. Whereas in a traditional single family rental, good luck having any idea as a landlord even what's happening on a regular basis inside that home. It's the same for an apartment as well. And I've owned and managed all three and still do. But yeah, I would argue that from a real neighbor experience perspective, co-living is a far better experience than any of those or short-term rental. We've certainly gotten pushback, no question. And there are kind of two camps. One is, well, based on this idea, well, I don't want those people in my community, period, right? And I can't solve that. Mm-hmm. If that's really how a neighborhood or a community feels, you need to check yourself. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, this is America. All men are created equal. Like, people should be able to find a place to live in communities where they're working. And if you're okay going to the grocery store and having this person behind the butcher counter, but you're not okay with them living in your neighborhood, like that doesn't make sense to me. But it is still absolutely something that gives people pause. On the other hand, you just have folks that are afraid. And I think sometimes it's natural that, oh, well, are there going to be too many cars? Is this going to lower my property value? Is the house going to be properly maintained? Are these people going to care about the community? And we've been around long enough that we have the experience to show that, look, all of those fears are generally unfounded and addressable. And that's really what we focus on doing every single day is just making sure that we can address any of those substantive concerns.
And now a word from my paid sponsor, PadSplit. Look, if you've been trying to make single-family rentals pencil out in this market, you already know that the math can be tight. With high rates, properties that would have cash flowed 5 years ago now often break even at best. So what do? You wait on the sidelines and miss out, or maybe you find a better model? That's why I want to talk about today's sponsor, PadSplit. Here's an example of the math in some markets. A 4-bedroom renting for $2,700 as a traditional rental may be able to gross over $6,000 a month in a co-living setup through PadSplit, depending on location, occupancy, and costs. The same house can potentially more than double the gross revenue in the right market. And before you think, that sounds like a headache, PadSplit helps with member screening and rent collection while still allowing you to operate the property and make management decisions. This is one strategy investors use to try to make deals work when traditional rentals don't pencil. If you want to see the numbers for yourself, go to padsplit.com/hosts. I'll have a link in the description. Just run the math on the property you already own and see if it's a fit. You might be surprised. So Atticus, we have 400 people in our company that is in the property management, property development. We have about 10,000 tenants, and so we're super clear on the property management side of the equation. Like where do you guys draw the line on what's the responsibility of the homeowner and what's the where does the PadSplit step in?
Well, it's really the unique thing about PadSplit as a marketplace specifically is we focus on the things that we feel like you can't do exceptionally well, where we have a lot of value to add. And the three main categories, if you think about property management as an umbrella, where you've got resident management on one side and property maintenance almost on the other, we don't really do anything in the property maintenance realm. And so where we focus our energies are filling rooms really, really quickly, like faster than anyone else can. So we'll spend over $1.5 million in marketing this month to help fill rooms really, really quickly. And the average time across all 32,000 units from the time of listing to the time that first room gets booked is less than 7 days on average, which is really, really fast by pretty much any measure in the residential property space. The second thing is making sure that when those people come to our site, that they can move through an application process, usually just within a couple of minutes. They can book a room and move in within 24 to 48 hours. There are no showings whatsoever. So that's a different type of paradigm than the way that most property management companies have been set up. But so all the leasing that you would traditionally do in a property management role is now firmly in our camp. If you want to fill the unit on your own, you can. And that saves you the fee that we would usually charge to fill that unit. Then all of the collections. So all rent payments, especially because we're billing on a weekly or per payday basis. If you have a house with 6 people sharing and you're billing weekly, you now have over 25 payments per month to account for. Well, that becomes burdensome really, really quickly for most landlords. So we do all of that as well. And then we become the first stop of any sort of he said, she said, roommate issues. And we built into our system kind of 360-degree accountability where residents can rate and review each other. They can rate and review the home. Hosts can rate and review the individual residents as well. And everybody can talk together through the platform or mobile app. So yeah, that's kind of the basic idea of what we provide. And then increasingly, it's becoming more and more valuable for our hosts just with the data that we have, because we've had so many different units around the country.
And how do you onboard new homes? Are they homes? Are they apartments? Are they condos? How about
all
that?
The above.
Okay.
All the above. I encourage any potential landlord to think of us as just an arrow in the quiver, right? We are a tool not dissimilar from like a short-term rental strategy or a long-term rental strategy, or if you're only operating for travel nurses or flight attendants. Like this is an arrow in your quiver that you can deploy as needed. We're increasingly getting more and more contacts from apartment managers, not because people earn more net revenue to rent a studio through our platform than they would otherwise. They don't in that case, but because we can fill those units much more quickly and they need occupancy. In most cases, though, the reason why owners come to us is because they want to increase their bottom line, and they've seen that doing the math on 4, 5, 6, 7 bedrooms, they're going to make significantly more net operating income through this co-living PadSplit model than they would through either a traditional rental or, in many cases, a short-term rental.
Oh, I know. One of the things that we used to do was we built some of these senior housing projects where we would do like a common area, common area kitchen, common area this, common area that, and then we would put an individual bedrooms with their own baths. And one of the frustrations was actually keeping those full, because the traditional property management model just doesn't work very well, where there'd be 2 full, maybe 1, and they start getting into this. So I can see a huge niche here to be able to capitalize on these individual rooms. We used to build them that way. But our frustration was the traditional property manager had a heck of a time, to your point, with all the accounting and all the other stuff. I was constantly banging on them, like, you got to get, these need to be 4, because we had 4, for common, and it was our occupancy could never get up and beyond 70-80% as a result of that.
Yeah, we'll have like 45,000 support tickets to our platform like this month. So there are a lot of touch points for sure.
Well, and the 7 days is impressive. I mean, really, it's impressive. I mean, because the big issue in my world is vacancy, right? And concession. To be honest, because concession, oftentimes you have to. Nobody really talks about that much, but if you have to offer a month free or 2 months free to for a 12-month lease, that's a reduction in rent. So this is a heck of a service.
Yeah. And I mean, I came to this model naturally. So I first started experimenting with shared housing in 2009 because there were some people in a really crappy rooming house next door that was being foreclosed. And they came to me and said, "Hey, can we rent rooms in your vacant house?" And I was like, "Yes, please." Because I was terrified that somebody's going to walk away with appliances any day. And they did. And then 7 years later, I was looking back on just comparing profit and loss statements across my portfolio of all sorts of different assets. And I saw that these rent by the room properties just beat the pants off of everything else. The problem was they were so much work operationally to maintain. And that was the other piece of starting PadSplit was I knew that there was enough technology out there where you could create this operational services layer to take off that burden of all of that work. And I figured if you can do that and you can still give the underlying property owner the ability to make more money, there are a lot of owners who would do that. So that's how we got started, was just
it's really smart. I tell the story sometimes. My sister, who was a bookkeeper up in the Seattle area, didn't go into formal education at all. She bought 5 houses this way, and her biggest issue was accounting and tenant turnover. But she said there's a huge niche, that people would come in and they don't want to stay at a hotel for a week or 2 or 3 weeks. But what crushed her was all the accounting and the weekly rents and stuff like that. But she did this for years, and I like to see this formalized now.
Well, yeah, what's always been true, just talking about your profit and loss statement as an owner, and you touched on this earlier, is like your vacancy loss, right? And the period of time, not just that you're not collecting rent from that unit, but you're continuing to have to pay all those expenses. So that's one of the biggest detractors from your profitability over time. The second is your turn costs. And what I mean by turn costs is like when a resident moves out of especially a single family home or an apartment, if they've been there for even 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you've got to go back and re-renovate that unit. And in a single family home, you're easily talking $10,000 in many cases. Well, in rent by the room, when you have a turn, the turn is almost the equivalent of like cleaning a hotel room because they're fully furnished, because all utilities are included. It's super, super fast, and average we hear from our owners just across the board is like $76 to turn an individual room. And then because we fill those units really, really quickly, you're lowering your vacancy loss. And when you have 1 bedroom out of 6 maybe that is vacant, that's a lot better than having 1 out of 1 that's vacant. So you're really cutting down on your vacancy loss and your turn costs. And then we just need to make sure that that's scalable for any owner. But like that's always been true for room rentals, the vacancy loss turn cost thing. We just make it a lot easier and then refill those units much faster than they would ordinarily be.
So let's talk real numbers. So if someone's converting their traditional single family, how much of a rent lift or a profitability lift are you talking about monthly?
So realistically, and of course it depends market by market, but in any given market, you should expect that your yield on that property or your unlevered return on cost, or some people use cap rate, you should expect about 2x relative to what you would get as a single family rental. In some cases, like if a market is really tight, it might be 150% versus a 2x, but it's really significant relative to a long-term rental where a deal that did not work before now does, or a deal that was maybe halfway decent before is now off the charts. And I mean, it's good enough to the point where we see a lot of our hosts that are out building new construction PadSplit homes.
Yeah.
Whereas I don't know a lot of people that are doing infill new construction, just long-term rentals.
Yeah. What's the average occupancy typically? I know I love the model, the weekly model, but it seems to me, because we've done some of this stuff. We have spring training going on right now. We're in Scottsdale, Arizona, and there's a lot of stuff. Short term is a thing outside of the Airbnb or VRBO model. But what do people normally stay? How long?
Yeah. So average stay right now is about 9.5 months.
Oh, okay.
Now that's really bifurcated though.
Yeah.
Some people, around 11% of residents will stay around 30 days or so. But then 25% will stay more than a year.
Oh, wow.
So like the first home I told you about that I opened had 4 bedrooms, and the third person who moved in, this was 2009. She was working at Wendy's. She's still there today in the same room 17 years later. So it's not at all uncommon when I ask hosts, usually someone from that first cohort of move-ins to their property is still there, and they will just stay there over and over. And so what's interesting about occupancy is a lot of people, when they're brand new to this platform, they think, man, there's a lot of turnover. There's a lot of turnover here quickly. And like, that's true to some degree, because you have kind of a 1 in 4 to 1 in 6 chance that one person stays for a long time. And then you have people cycle through, but that one room stays occupied. And then of the second group of people that move in, maybe one of those people stays longer. And so in my houses that I operate, I mean, I have 6-bedroom houses pretty typically. I'm filling one room, but 4 or 5 out of those 6 people who live there have been there for years and years.
Yeah.
And so that's another interesting dynamic to this that is different than traditional rent.
And I wanted to ask you, is that because the renter wants the flexibility? Sometimes they're on thin ice. They don't always know, how long they're going to be somewhere. For what could be obviously personally, could be financially, could be for their job. But it kind of blows my mind that people would rather pay a higher weekly and have that flexibility than 6 or 9 month lease like you had described.
Yeah. So it's both is the short answer. The bigger thing is overcoming those barriers to entry. And a traditional apartment, like $1,500. Okay, well, if you're paying $1,500 for your deposit, $1,500 for the first month's rent, you're $3,000 right there. You haven't turned on utilities. You haven't paid any utility deposits. You haven't furnished. And we already know that 40% of the American population doesn't have $400 to spend on emergency expense.
Yeah.
Right. And so how do you expect people to do that? And at the same time, we know that 1/3 of the entire rental population in the United States is a 1 or 2 person household who makes less than $35,000 a year.
Yep.
And so it's just an enormous segment of the population that I think is largely invisible and is one that not a lot of people think about, that are really looking for this type of unit because they just don't qualify or they don't have the savings to move into something else. So it's not just quote unquote affordability. It's, can I actually get in? Can I qualify and can I get in? And you're talking about easily 1/3 of the entire rental population in the US that can't answer that question affirmatively for a traditional living environment. So it's a huge market for us and this type of product.
Yeah, we're starting to see that Apple Pay Later or the Pay Later, the people that are kind of taking over that call that weekly payment piece. Is that competing with you guys at all?
No, it hasn't. I mean, the reason why we do weekly, number one, because it just makes those payments bite-sized. And as an owner operator, I saw many times over where you'd go to the kind of pre-trial diversion thing when you have an eviction and you're going through mediation, and the people who couldn't pay $800 a month in rent now all of a sudden can pay $250 a week.
Yeah.
And you're like, wait a second, like that math doesn't math. How is that possible? And the simple answer was that it's not about the math. It's about the mindset. meaning like today is March the 9th. We're recording this. Okay, well, what day of the week is April 1st? I don't know. and it's just one of these assumptions that we all make in the real estate industry that, oh, rent should always be due on the 1st. But then at the same time, a landlord will tell me, well, of course I want to get paid. Okay, well, what day of the week is the 1st of the next month? And nobody knows, right? And it has nothing to do with when your renter actually gets paid. And you know that those renters are living paycheck to paycheck. So why on earth wouldn't we create this weekly system that has everything bundled into one payment? And that's really why our collections rates never drop below 97.5%. It's not because of credit scores, which we don't even check for anymore. It's not because of upfront deposits. It's because we just make it really easy for people to pay. And we operate under the assumption that most people want housing, whether they want it because of flexibility or affordability. And we provide both.
That's an impressive stat. You're collecting 97.5% on a weekly payment plan.
Yeah, today it's like 98.6.
That's insane. Yeah, that's
never
better than
97.
most. That's better than most property management companies.
So I do have a question about evictions because we have to talk about that.
Sure.
I think that, a lot of landlords are thinking that, right? If I'm renting to somebody room week to week, I'm not checking their credit. What if they're a problem to the other roommates? What if they don't pay? How do I get this person out of there legally? And what's that look like? And do you handle that, or does the landlord have to handle that?
Yeah. So I'll give you the stats first. So the national eviction rate for just normal rentals is between 7.3 and 7.8%. The PadSplit average eviction rate, and this is eviction status, which I'll tell you means something different, is 1.3% right now. So about 1/6 of the national average. Why is that lower? And what does eviction status mean? Eviction status for us means that that resident starts as a PadSplit member. Okay, and they have the ability to transfer across all 32,000 of our units. So PadSplit membership is its own thing that's separate from a traditional like tenancy type of agreement. So eviction status means that they haven't paid or they've broken the rules and they can lose their PadSplit membership. So that's when they go into eviction status. But the percentage of people that actually get an eviction filing is only about 0.3% on average. So 0.3% versus 7.3 to 7.8%. So way, way lower. Now, why is that the case? Especially when you're talking about relatively low income, low credit customers. Part of it is the weekly all-inclusive payments, right? And I think that's probably the lion's share of why. But when you do end up in a situation where someone has to go through an eviction process, the owner ultimately is the one who has to push that red button. We have the membership termination steps, and we work with some other nonprofit partners to provide just emergency assistance to those individuals when they need. And we try to work out payment plans, assuming that an owner agrees to it in any case where it's a possibility. But at the end of the day, like after their membership has been terminated, if they dig their heels in and they're one of that 0.3% of residents, then the owner or the property manager is the one who pushes the red button and actually files for that eviction. We do have an ecosystem of support providers who can help with that process, but the owner or the property manager is always the one who kind of has to push that button.
And do you find when somebody has to evict that it makes everyone want to then leave, or is this usually like isolated to that particular person?
Yeah, it's usually the other way around. And I think that's one of the other reasons, in addition to kind of the weekly all-inclusive payments, that our eviction rate is so low, is because, look, it's uncomfortable when you are under eviction for non-payment and you're in a home that's shared with other people, right? No one's usually very proud of not being able to pay their bills. And I suspect that just social issue kind of causes a lot of people to move out amicably. The other big thing that's important that I'm sure y'all can relate to, or anyone who's been a landlord can relate to, if you have a resident in a traditional single family home or apartment that stops paying, your visibility inside that unit is nothing. Like, especially if it's contentious in any way, like, there's no way that you're getting into that unit, and there's very little communication in most cases. Someone will go radio silent. Well, in this shared housing situation in a PadSplit, you now have visibility, quote unquote, inside that unit 24/7, 365. You're still sending in your cleaners, you're sending in your maintenance people for all sorts of different things. And like you have other people coming and going inside that home. So it's maybe a little bit more awkward than it would be if you could just shut the door and forget your problems, because like people are inside the home, and you as a landlord can now make sure that nobody's destroying the kitchen or the bathrooms or inviting over all sorts of interesting guests to tear up the place.
Yeah.
And do you also have more leverage because it's week to week, because they're not in a traditional like 30-day lease? Are they more of like a guest than a tenant?
So landlord tenant law works the exact same in just about every jurisdiction that we're in. I'm not aware of any that have specific carve outs for shared housing or rent by the room. There are a few jurisdictions that have things where if you're an owner occupant and you're renting a room, but most of the courts don't even understand this anyway because they're so rare. So we always tell hosts, assume you're under landlord tenant law. So it's not that you have more leverage, it's that you have greater awareness to intervene early. Meaning, because payments are weekly, like if someone misses a payment, you're going to know really quickly that something's wrong, versus if you're waiting on a monthly basis, then they've gotten farther behind and it might be too big of a hole for them to dig themselves out of.
So, Atticus, I was going to ask, I was fascinated by this whole model. First of all, congratulations. I think it's hitting an incredible niche. Are you? Would you consider yourself more like Uber or more like Airbnb? I'm sure you've been asked this question.
It's a great question. You know, the real answer is neither, but more akin to an Uber, I think, than an Airbnb. Like one of the things that's interesting for us versus like an I'll compare us to Airbnb. So two things, like one, there's not, and this is maybe true for Uber too, like those are transactional relationships. You have one ride or one stay, maybe you stay at a place more than once, or maybe you call your favorite Uber driver more than once. But for us, it's relational over time, and that relationship changes over time. It's not like you move in and you rate and that's your experience for the rest of the time you're there, especially if you're there for 9 months or longer. Like, your opinion is going to change on day 7 and day 132, right? And so you have to account for that. The other interesting thing is it's not just a relationship between the person paying for the room and the room provider as it is in an Airbnb or in an Uber. Think of it like Uber shared, right? Where now you have someone else in there with you, and that's a huge part of your experience. And if they are messy, well, it doesn't matter how nice your host is. If the other resident is messy or noisy, like that's going to color your experience dramatically. And so our platform has to account for all of those different types of ongoing relationships, whereas I'm not sure that either of those other two platforms really have to do that. And then the second part is just from affordability perspective. I mean, if we were going to look at our quote unquote like nightly rate in the way that Airbnb would across the platform, it's probably like $26, $27 a night. So just really apples and oranges there.
So every investment has a lane, and it has a lane where it doesn't work, right? So what is your ideal single family home? How is it set up? The location, the price point? Like, where does this work generally?
Well, it depends a lot on your perspective as a host. I'm going to assume that, like, certainly most of our hosts they come for the income, even if they stay for the impact. But if they're looking to increase their bottom line, there are absolutely places where it works or doesn't. If you have a 1-bedroom apartment or a 1-bedroom condo, like, you're not going to be able to generate more income because you're not moving in more than one person. You really start to see the tipping point in single family around 4 bedrooms or more. Sometimes we've seen hosts with 3 that do okay, but the system really starts to work better and better at like the 4th bedroom and above. And that's where you drive a lot of your income. So smaller houses, and most of the ones that I had before PadSplit that are just 2-bedroom, 900 square foot houses, they're not great. Like, could you do it? Sure. Would you still have lower vacancy loss, lower turn cost? Yes. But like, you're not going to get that dollar for dollar 2x increase in rental income the same way that you would if you convert like a 3 or 4 bedroom into a 6 to 8 bedroom, because you've now taken the daylight basement and created extra bedrooms, or the formal dining room is usually a really easy conversion, or a home office. That's where your sweet spot is. The other one I would say, so that's like a housing type where it works or doesn't. Areas where it works or doesn't. If you're in a high-end HOA with lots of nosy neighbor Karens that are always in your business, like, it's going to be a slog. And like, that's probably true for rentals or Airbnbs as well. But I don't think it's worth your energy or time to kind of choose those areas where you're going to have a big problem with.
Right, because they're going to fight you on every little thing.
Yeah, exactly.
But what if you're in like a non-HOA and a more high-end area? So like, say you're getting, I don't know, let's call it $3,000 for a 4-bedroom.
Like DC, like, you go to these areas that are not affordable, right?
Yeah. And are people really willing to pay, like, because let's just use that example, $3,000 on a 4-bedroom. Are people really willing to pay like $1,500 per room to live with people?
Yes.
Okay. So they're not like, I'm just going to get a studio apartment instead of doing this.
Yeah. Well, chances are if you're paying $3,000, your studio rent or your 1-bedroom rent is still probably, like here in DC, it's probably $2,000. Easy.
Yeah.
Which, like, that math doesn't really make sense either, but like, it's just the way that the market works, right? The studio or the 1-bedroom is the highest rent, the highest cost per square foot, but then the 2-bedroom is worth less, the third bedroom is worth less, so forth and so on. Like, that's why rent by the room works. That's why it's always been more profitable, even long before PadSplit ever existed, is because you just price that first bedroom at, call it 75% or even less of that studio. But now the second bedroom is the exact same, third bedroom is the exact same, fourth, fifth, umpteenth, right? And so that's why it works. But we've seen, at $1,500, I think you're still easily in a sweet spot, especially if you have a nice home with maybe a private bathroom. Like, there are plenty of rooms on the platform that are in that range, and some are more than that. And yeah, we see studio apartments rent as well through the platform. But the thing to keep in mind is just, where's your market? From like, where do they live? Who are they? Why do they want this type of product? And where we really rely on our hosts to come up with different strategies. But we had one in Atlanta where, really nice part of town, they had it rented for $680 a week for a room. Okay. And I thought, this is absolutely crazy. Who on earth does this? And turns out that it's some entrepreneur who lives in New York who has a lot of business in Atlanta, and it's cheaper and easier for him to do this. And he likes having a shared housing community versus getting a hotel room where he can't leave his clothes. Okay. Well, like, how big is that market population? Probably not very big, right? So this host found this really interesting niche where there were enough people who wanted to do that. Would I recommend that strategy to a large number of hosts? Absolutely not. And again, like, 1/3 of the rental population are 1 or 2 person households that make less than $35,000 a year. Like, that's where I'm focused as a host, and what I feel is really easy to bank on if you are thinking about this model. Does it mean that you can't have a luxury unit? No, absolutely not. But I can't tell you with any degree of certainty how many people there are that are looking for that type of product.
So, Atticus, if somebody wanted to invest in this space, like, and use your firm plus, let's say, a property manager, I'm talking about somebody who just wanted the passive income. Maybe they wanted to build, or maybe they wanted to buy, and just use this as a go-forward model. What would you tell them?
Well, so there are a couple of ways. It depends on how passive they want to be, right? If you want to own the asset, you just go to padsplit.com/hosts. You link up with one of our account execs, and they can hook you up with a property manager in a given area. If you don't want to invest in your backyard, or even if you do, we probably have a property manager there if you really want to be hands off. A lot of our hosts want to self-manage though. Like we do a lot of the heavy lifting, and just like many Airbnb hosts decide that they are quote unquote hosting themselves, even if they have a separate team for maintenance and whatnot. So that's probably the most common situation. But if you want to be entirely passive, there are absolutely funds and even secondary markets now that you can invest in that invest in pad splits. You're probably familiar with some of these fractional investing platforms. Mogul is the one, MOGUL is the one that is probably the most popular with PadSplit. They've done a bunch where you can invest as little, I think, as $250 all the way up to as much as you want. And they're operating the unit and you are totally hands off. So it runs the gamut if you want to self-manage or if you want to be totally passive.
So you have to have heard some wild stories. So name your best story that you've heard hosting, all these roommates.
You don't have to say who or what city.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you one, and this is even pre-PadSplit. And then they're like, don't get me wrong, the stories that I love are the ones where there's just incredible impact. And I'll tell you two quick ones. The first one was pre-PadSplit, and I have this saying that's now known, I think, among most of our hosts: bad things happen on sofas. And the origin story of that quote, and the reason why I don't put large sofas in any of my homes, is because I had decorated and staged the living room, that first house that I did in 2009, and got plants and nice living room furniture and everything. And it was like less than a month in, one of the roommates walked in on another roommates and a very close friend on the sofa in the living room, in spite of the fact that they had their own bedroom. And it just like, what do I say? Like, as a landlord, that's not the situation.
That's not in the rental stipulation.
I thought I was gonna have to get into. So really, since that point, it occurred to me, and there have been other instances in the living room where I said, look, like, people think of these common areas as places for community, but based on that early experience, more often than not, they're places for conflict. And so that's maybe one of the funnier ones, and people will remember that bad things happen on sofas. One of the other ones which is one of my favorites, the first PadSplit house, the prototype that I did in 2017, one of the first women who moved in, her name was Tiffany, and she was living in an extended stay motel, really crappy, east of Atlanta off I-20. And in her own words, she would have to dodge drug dealers and prostitutes every night to get to the bus stop for her job as a night shift security guard at a film studio. And she came out to the house and said, I've never lived in a situation like this, meaning shared housing, but this is the nicest house I've ever seen. She was paying $1,200 a month. This is 2017, $1,200 a month at the extended stay motel. She was paying $550 with me. So she started saving $600 a month, putting it under her mattress, which is not a strategy I recommend, but it worked out well for her. 3 months in, she's able to save up for her own used smart car, so she doesn't have to take the bus anymore at night. And 3 months after that, she has a deposit and moves into her own apartment. And my net operating income went from $1,100 a month as a traditional single family rental to $2,300 a month. So this was not charity by any stretch of the imagination, but like, that story really stuck with me ever since then, because like, one, it was inspiring. Two, I felt almost guilty that like I was still making money even though I had created this outcome. But then the last piece was making me a little bit angry, and like, why isn't everyone doing this? Like, why is this not a thing when you can change somebody's life and make more money at the same time? And so that's still one of my favorite stories, but we get to hear so many every day. And why I say, like, when you do that and you're making money, like, that's really addictive. And why I think so many of our hosts stay with the platform.
Well, that's part of your mission as a public benefit corporation, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's chartered in our bylaws.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So how do people reach you? You know, we obviously love what you do, and we appreciate all your support with us as well. What's the best way people can onboard? Maybe they're looking for a place to rent, or maybe they're looking to host.
Yeah, so if they're looking to rent, just go to PadSplit.com, and that whole experience is set up for them. They can download the app as well. That's how most of our renters find us. And then if they're looking to host, just go to padsplit.com/hosts and just fill out a quick questionnaire, and we'll have an account exec reach out to them. I'm most active on LinkedIn. I found I really only have time for one social media channel. So I generally write on LinkedIn.
I get that. Yeah.
And I write a lot about housing policy on LinkedIn as well. So that's usually where you can find me.
And also, Atticus, we do a big conference in Scottsdale called Limitless Expo. We'll have maybe 800 accredited investors, 2,000 people come. But if you're interested in coming this year, we'll send you the info. Yeah, I'd love to talk to you on a panel, about what you're doing if you're open.
Yeah, no, would love to do it, and always enjoy spreading the PadSplit good news.
Yeah, for sure. And congrats on your success too. This is a niche I think that's helping everyone.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's been a labor, but a labor of love, and really, really grateful and privileged to get to do what I do every day. And thanks so much for the time.
Yeah, my pleasure. And we'll chat with you soon. Thanks,
Atticus.